Long before there was a catchphrase called foreign policy for the middle class, there was a Vermont mayor on C-SPAN fighting for exactly that thing.
The challenge of our time is to wake people up, to talk about the real issues. We spend $300 billion on military while we cut back on programs for the elderly.
Now, he's a U.S. Senator. And Bernie Sanders has pretty much spent his entire career in Washington questioning whether government decisions really serve working people or the 1%.
All over this country, there is growing concern about the NAFTA agreement.
We are allied with the feudalistic monarchies of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Does that have anything to do with freedom? Government is doing an excellent job if you're rich and powerful. But if you're one of the ordinary people in America, government has failed you.
But for a long time, Bernie was a little lonely in his views. More of a cult figure, beloved by Vermont hippies and folks with Democracy Now! Tote bags. 2 tight presidential primaries and a wave of grassroots energy later, he's the face of a movement.
This campaign is going to send a message to the billionaire class. You can't have it all.
It's a weird shift. And it's been just as weird for the people he works with.
My own role has been both as kind of a critic, but now working in government, more someone who's working inside government while still critical.
That's Bernie Sanders' foreign policy czar, Matt Duss. As a journalist and think tank blogger, Matt pushed back on some of the Washington consensus about how we engage with the world. But in 2017, Matt became one of Sanders' top advisors, working to shape new ideas for what U.S. foreign policy could look like. We reached out to Matt because, well, we'd spent a whole season thinking about this idea of foreign policy for the middle class. And we wanted to know from the perspective of someone whose boss has been thinking about these ideas for such a long time, is it anything more than a slogan? Matt says that question might be missing the point.
Politics involves slogans. I mean, that's what helps unite coalitions and movements and leads to actual policy.
I'm Lacey Healy, and today, on a special bonus episode of Things That Go Boom, how's that slogan doing? And how do you move from fighting words to systemic change? Hey, it's Lacey. As you likely already know, we are living in the golden age of cybercrime. How can we ensure the security of our information and our financials, not to mention our peace of mind? Well, I recommend listening to What the Hack with Adam Levin. It's a weekly true crime podcast featuring tales of hacks, scams, and a rattle bag of cyber swindles. Learn about the dangers of trolling opponents, discover what sort of links you should never, ever click, and get the inside scoop on all sorts of crazy scams happening on your favorite apps. So go ahead, follow What the Hack with Adam Levin on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. There's a weird view of bipartisan consensus in Washington. Sometimes the vibe is, if both parties agree on an idea, then it must be right. When Bernie Sanders ran to be the Democratic candidate against Trump in 2020, he and Matt refused to accept that narrative. For example, when Trump decided to reach out to North Korea, Sanders shared his support.
Meeting face-to-face with your adversaries is a good idea.
And when Trump slapped harsh sanctions on Venezuela after Nicolas Maduro refused to give up the presidency, Sanders said he didn't think sanctions were the right way to handle it.
Sometimes you have unintended consequences when a powerful nation goes in and tells people who their government will be.
Both of those opinions go against long-established dogma in Washington over who is our enemy and who is our friend. Friends like Saudi Arabia, whose war in Yemen we've backed for years, even refueling planes in the sky.
I would make it very clear. We were not going to, in fact, sell more weapons to them. We were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are.
They've kind of pulled back a bit from Yemen, but there's still a big gray area in terms of support we're giving to the Saudi Air Force and what those planes are doing inside Yemen. They chose not to sanction MBS for the murder, which we know his role he played in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and attempted kidnappings and real actual kidnappings and harassment of Saudi dissidents and critics We have to work with imperfect governments, let's say, to achieve our security goals at some times. But I think we could be doing a lot more to shrink that space or to kind of close those areas of tension between our rhetoric and our actual policy. And I think our relationship with Saudi Arabia is one of those areas where it's extremely glaring.
Not to mention that this fall, the Biden administration still approved more than $1 billion in weapons sales to the kingdom. Despite campaign promises, Biden hasn't really moved the needle on Saudi Arabia. And in some ways, that reflects how hard it is to move the needle on anything in Washington. This fall, falsely believing that they were targeting an ISIS fighter in Kabul, U.S. fighters killed a family of 10.
What we saw there in Kabul with those children's shredded bodies is that we are exporting insecurity onto the rest of the world in the name of our security.
I am now convinced that as many as 10 civilians, including up to 7 children, were tragically killed in that strike. It was a mistake, and I offer my sincere apology.
When Matt and I talk, it's only a couple of days after a Pentagon report finally shares their thought process behind this killing. He is not satisfied.
The report was, this was bad, but the process was followed, and the lawyers okayed it. So, there's going to be no disciplinary action taken. And I'm sorry, but you are telling me that the process worked and the process murders children. I don't accept that.
This kind of heavy weight on the scales, favoring American life, Matt says that's something he wants to confront.
There's a political fear. If we're not following this guy's car around Afghanistan on suspicion that he's part of ISIS, then there could be another attack, and that would be really bad, and that would derail our whole presidency. And of course, it would kill Americans. That is, of course, that is the job of the government to protect Americans from being killed. But I think we have amped ourselves up so much, and we are on such a constant war footing about this. And it feels, again, glib to sit here and say we need to be able to accept some measure of risk. But I think that's really what it is.
It's not just about American lives, though. It's also about the stories we told ourselves that created this instability. Stories that we continue to tell ourselves today. Matt says there's a lot we got wrong about Afghanistan.
We built and fed and sustained a corrupt government and failed disastrously to confront that corruption. Corruption was always seen as secondary to security. Let's get security first. Let's defeat the insurgency, and then we'll deal with corruption. And it was backwards, right? Because corruption was feeding the insurgency.
Duss knows that there are loads of analysts and humanitarian workers who've documented the many ways that life will be worse for Afghans back under Taliban control. But he also says that's precisely why it's so telling that some people were willing to accept Taliban leadership.
And that is what I think Washington has yet to really come to grips with. As bad as the Taliban are, many people in Afghanistan preferred them to the government we created. And let's try and understand why. But that would require, actual introspection. And there's one thing Washington does not tend to do well.
One example, the abundance of pushback that Biden got over the Afghanistan withdrawal. Not just about the logistics of it, but about doing it at all.
The response on the part of the foreign policy establishment was essentially just this frenzied, frantic attempt to dump 20 years of policy failure into the lap of the Biden administration. And I think we really need to understand what that means and what the implications for that could be for future courageous steps that this president or future presidents might be more or less inclined to take, knowing that this is the response they will get from the establishment and the DC furniture, as I sometimes call it, who are just kind of ideologically and emotionally invested in the project of American empire.
Not just ideologically and emotionally.
I'm sitting here in Northern Virginia. I mean, this place, if you want to know where the U.S. taxpayer dollars, over $2 trillion, some of this went, just look at all the Teslas that are driving around Northern Virginia. Look at all these huge McMansions that have gone up. This is where so much of this money ended up.
Look at just one stock on the market, On September 10th, 2001, Lockheed Martin's share price was hovering around $38. It's now valued at $340, almost 9 times as much as where it was that day. War, it makes good money.
So I think there was that profit motive. Obviously, you have the military-industrial complex, which is a word I think no one should be shy about using, because I think even though Eisenhower coined it, he'd be, I think, just mortified at how that came to pass beyond even his wildest nightmares.
Your point about the Teslas reminds me of the end of the Cold War. Actually, there was a move to shrink the military-industrial complex. Industry rallied. Industry all band together in order to, sort of essentially find the next war.
Yeah.
Are we doing that now again?
I can't imagine what the next war could be.
What could it possibly be?
What could it possibly be?
About?
Is there some other country out there that is all the rage, is like the new hotness? Yes, of course. Coming soon, the U.S.-China conflict.
That's right after the break. "21 years ago, there was a totally different conversation about China in Washington.
You will be witnessing the arrival of a very special aircraft and view the offloading of 2 VIPs, very important pandas.
Waiting is finally over. 2 giant pandas from China will be coming to the Smithsonian Institution's National Zoological Park.
And this is a live shot of their enclosure at the National Zoo. I don't actually see the pandas. There, that's live video of the pandas.
Remember that back in the 70s, First Lady Pat Nixon accepted the first 2 pandas from China that symbolized our thawing politics?
I think pandemonium is going to break out right here at the zoo.
Well, in December of 2000, China sent 2 new pandas over. A moment that came just months after lawmakers agreed to open up our markets.
We are going to have a final vote here in a moment. I think it's going to be an overwhelming vote. I think it is the right thing to do, and I commend
today
Chairman
of the bill granting China permanent normal trading status with the U.S. The vote approving the measure was 83 to 15.
The more China opens its markets to our products, the wider it opens its doors to economic freedom, and the more fully it will liberate the potential of its people.
Those bears might not have known it, but just like their predecessors, they were in the middle of another quickly changing relationship.
How much bamboo do they eat a day?
They're eating about 100 pounds a day between the 2 of them, and that's a good amount of bamboo. We're very pleased. That's what they should be eating.
Everyone was absolutely convinced that opening China to trade and bringing it into the WTO was going to make Chinese people much richer, and then, of course, they would become much more liberal.
That's liberal in the sense of welcoming the free exchange of money and ideas, not the U.S. domestic political sense.
And this would help transform China because, making lots of money what's bad about that? What could ever go wrong? And now that has shifted 180 degrees. People are like, well, that didn't happen. But what is absolutely true now is that, China represents the biggest threat to American security and prosperity. And therefore, we all need to kind of gather around this threat and figure out how to deal with it. And that's concerning because you can obviously see the angle for the military-industrial complex.
You can see that tension heating up in the South China Sea lately. What does Matt think of how we're responding?
My own view is ambiguity is not a very satisfying, especially for the hawks. It's not like a very satisfying kind of policy, but it has tended to work. So I think let's keep it cloudy. And I think some of Biden's comments have kind of not done that. They've been much more clearly saying we would defend, I think let's understand what the Taiwanese want. I think we saw some interesting comments from the military attaché of TECRA, which is basically the Taiwan embassy. They don't have an embassy because we don't officially recognize them, but essentially this office that acts as the Taiwan representation here in Washington, saying, let's not jump at the bait. China's doing what it's doing. It's provocative, yes, but the people of Taiwan themselves understand quite clearly that, Taiwan is a really potent national issue in China. And if the United States decides, as some of our more hawkish colleagues want, that we should state clearly that we will not accept it, that would provoke a response. And that's probably not a smart thing to do. And if you want to know why? Let's listen to the folks who are kind of right there on the doorstep who would face those consequences most severely, and that's the people of Taiwan.
Matt also thinks that even though the CCP is doing a lot we don't like, we still need to find the areas where we can work together, like the pandemic or climate change.
It's going to be hard, but ultimately we cannot turn this into preventing the growth of the Chinese people and the security and the prosperity of the Chinese people. That cannot be the expense of what we're doing, right? I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how can we promote our own security and prosperity without exporting insecurity and poverty? How can we work with others and be in solidarity with others around the world so that our security and prosperity does not come at their expense and, in fact, promotes these things together?
It's a lot to take on. So maybe it's not so surprising that Biden has been so focused on China that other priorities have sort of fallen off the radar. Take Iran's nuclear deal, which he promised would be a top priority. Almost a year later, no deal.
The way they slow-walked it empowered those critics, both here in the United States, who are always going to be critical of it. Because again, for the most part, critics of the Iran deal aren't critical of the provisions of the Iran deal. They're critical of making deals with Iran.
There's also this other problem with slow-walking the deal. See, other countries also have politics.
It also empowered those critics in Iran who were saying it wasn't Trump. It's just the American government.
While American hardliners debated a deal with Iran, Iranian hardliners were debating a deal with us.
For Biden to have run on, there were very few, kind of commitments he made in foreign policy that were as unequivocal as we're going to rejoin the deal. And then to take the time that they did, I think, undermined supporters of the deal inside Iran and empowered its critics and skeptics.
There have been some preliminary steps back toward the negotiating table, but the bigger problem on Biden's hands now is how to make an offer that won't just get thrown out by the next president.
But that gets to the broader problem in our politics right now, is that other countries, not just adversaries, but allies, cannot trust our commitments because the next president, whether it's Trump or whether it's, President Glenn Youngkin or whomever, might just decide, well, I'm not Biden, so I'm pulling out of this deal. And that's a bad way to do foreign policy. That's a bad way to sustain confidence.
That goal, sustaining confidence, maybe that's part of the reason why Biden's appearance on the international stage hasn't really been that different from Trump's. Or maybe Biden's just really busy trying to make sense of the America that Trump left behind.
President-elect of the United States of America, Donald Trump.
Ours was not a campaign, but rather an incredible and great movement made up of millions of hardworking men and women who love their country and want a better, brighter future for themselves and for their family.
Matt says that Election Day 2016 was a wake-up call for Democrats. The neoliberal economic model wasn't working.
The policy conversation on a whole range of areas, but including and especially on foreign policy, or not especially, but just kind of broadly, had been completely detached from a lot of Americans' lived experiences. That Trump was appealing to deep, deep concerns, suspicions on the part of a big section of the American people that this system was rigged and it was not working for them and it was making their lives worse rather than better.
So maybe it's not so surprising that we've been seeing occasional through lines there between Trump's approach and Biden's. One example, trade. Trump made huge waves when he proposed a 25% tariff on cars from Canada and Mexico that went against longstanding trade agreements. But at the Three Amigos Summit last month, our partners were just as stressed out about Biden's plan for subsidies on U.S. electric vehicles. Subsidies that are really important to deal with climate change, but would have a similar impact on our partners. Biden's team is clearly rethinking some old assumptions about whether making international corporations rich actually helps the American people.
But I think this is also reflected in the speech that Biden gave to Congress back, I think it was March, right? This kind of State of the Union type speech that he gave where, he essentially declared the neoliberal era over.
So if that era is over, what's next? Matt says if we're really interested in a foreign policy for the middle class, there's lots of cool things we can do that could benefit us domestically and also the rest of the world. Like a global waiver for big pharma patents so that anyone in the world can manufacture COVID-19 vaccines and maybe we all don't have to deal with the next Omicron variant.
Getting everyone in the world, or as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible, is not just a favor to other countries. It is something that helps the American people.
Directly.
Yeah, directly, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because, the slower we vaccinate people, the more variants arise.
Or taking the ideas behind the famous fight for $15 an hour and making them global.
How about a global minimum wage? Which would be, kind of another way of dealing with inequality and efforts by multinationals to seek out the cheapest labor and pay basically slave wages.
Or like, say, spending less on the defense budget and more on things like healthcare.
It's just how absurd it is when we are nickel and diming this. Are we going to give paid family leave for how many weeks? In this budget bill that my boss is working on, are we going to give people classes? Are we going to give them dental care? Which of these things are we going to cut? Meanwhile, we're going to continue to shovel money at the Pentagon with barely any debate. Again, if you want to know what a country's priorities are, then look at their budget. And what that signals, it's nothing good.
It's a chorus Bernie Sanders has been singing since his days on C-SPAN as mayor. But decades later, this idea still hasn't gotten much traction.
Imagine what it would look like if you had a president who came out and said, we're going to cut the defense budget by 10%. We're going to cut the defense budget so that it only equals like the 9 next countries instead of the 10. Even something like that. I mean, this city would just lose its mind. Because you're talking about people's boats. You're talking about people's jacuzzis. You're talking about their third homes. How dare you?
So is this city just an immovable object? Matt, somehow, still doesn't think so.
It's not immovable. I think what we've seen, just in the way that the political debate has shifted around a range of issues, including in foreign policy, this does not happen on its own. This happened because of the hard work and organizing and the blood, sweat, and tears of activists and movements and analysts and coalitions and members of Congress and others. So it can be done.
Are there enough of those people?
No, there need to be more of them. There are more of us every day.
Things That Go Boom is produced by Inkstick Media and distributed by PRX. This episode was produced by Katie Toth and me and edited by Ruth Morris and Layli Jaley. Darian Schulman writes the music for our show, and Robin Wise makes each episode sound its best. As always, we want to thank the foundations that make our work possible. The Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Colomb Foundation, Craig Newmark Foundation, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. And thank you to all of you for supporting our show. Don't forget, if you like the show, to leave us a review. You'd really be surprised how much difference those things make. And of course, you can come visit us anytime on social at Inkstick Media. We'll see you right back here for a new season in the new year, but stick around for more bonus content in the meantime.
We're watching one of the pandas eat right now. How close can you get to them?
We can get quite close to them, in other words, looking through a mesh wire and being able to see very close, but we never go in with them. That is not something that we would ever do.
Why?
They are bears.